Okay, well, we have an Oasis community here. Welcome to anybody who's here for the first time. A couple of good friends, in fact, a couple of good brothers-in-law are here this morning for the first time, Chris and Randy, so welcome. This is a little bit about my own background, so you know who it is that's talking to you and where I'm coming from. I'm genetically optimistic. I studied family medicine at Georgetown University. I practiced regular family medicine in Virginia for a number of years. And then I went back and did a residency in preventive medicine and studied public health. I've always been interested in helping people who struggle with their weight, so I studied some extra bariatric or obesity medicine also. And for a while I had a private clinic in Virginia where I focused exclusively on that. And I've practiced medicine for about 23 years, and I work now at Hope Clinic in Southwest Houston here in Chinatown. Oddly enough, I work at an Asian clinic. Don't ask me why, how I ended up there, but some of us who are not Asian work there, and of course we'll see anybody who comes in the door, but the clinic was started by the Asian community specifically to address the needs of that community. So I'm interested in cross-cultural health, community medicine, preventive medicine. This is not a nag session, so it's gentle support, you might say, opening a discussion. I'd like this community to stick around for a while, and the individuals in it. And so it's just a little discussion of some of the science and some practical ideas. And again, it's just opening the discussion. If you disagree with something, take a hike. No, I'm just kidding. If you disagree with something, by all means, speak up. So I don't know if you can see the steps here in the desert leading to the Oasis, but here we are. We finally made it after a long walk in the desert. We're here at the Oasis. So it seems to me that the most radical thing we can do as secular individuals and as a secular community is to live a long life. And since I was told this morning that I should expand my talk, which is either a dream or a nightmare, I'm not sure which, maybe a nightmare for you guys, but this was really impressed upon me a number of years ago when I went to a conference in Virginia, and I'd been to a number of conferences talking about weight management and obesity and stuff, which is a surprisingly complex topic, actually, from medical and other perspectives. But this was a conference that was in Virginia Beach. I lived close to Virginia Beach at the time, and it was one of the co-sponsors was NBC News, and I forget who the other principal co-sponsor was, but the reason NBC News was involved was, a lot of the discussion on topics like this occur at conferences, and they're rather academic and that kind of stuff, and the news doesn't really filter out to people in the community to help them, or it does so very slowly. And so NBC News figured, and the organizers figured, that by having one of the big media players involved, that if there were any consensus achieved on how to, let's say, identify the most successful techniques for helping people with their weight, then NBC News would, the media being involved right at the outset would help in getting that word out. And one of the most powerful things I heard at this conference was when a young Indian, a Native American leader, he was from, I think, a South Dakota reservation, maybe a Sioux reservation if I remember right, and he came from a relatively small community, everybody knows everybody, and he was talking about the impact of lifestyle issues in their community, where you have, for genetic reasons again, you have people who are particularly affected by things like diabetes and hypertension and heart disease. And he said that sometimes he would go into a room and he would look around and notice all the people who weren't there. People who should still be alive. And this really affected me emotionally. It still does. because people who died in their 40s and their 50s, even in their 60s, that's young. So we want people to stick around for a while. And I knew I was going to get emotional when I mentioned the story because it really affected me. I'll try not to be like this for the whole talk. So I decided to go online and see who else has the name of Healthy Oasis. And I found a restaurant in Manhattan over here. And then something that's kind of closed is Health Oasis over here, where you can get colon hydrotherapy if you want. and Mike said we can go ahead with that program. I think Stephanie I think put a sign-up list in the back there. So you may want to sign up for that. It's not mandatory. And it's very affordable. Oddly enough, this is my Reasons for Optimism slide. I know it doesn't look like a Reasons for Optimism, but I think we have to be upfront about what the leading causes of death are. If we're going to try to stick around for a while, let's take a look at what the leading causes of death are in the U.S. This is the most recent data I could find, 2011. And as you can see, heart disease and cancer are about neck and neck, and everything else is way behind. Now, some of these things overlap, of course. The diabetes contributes to the heart disease, and so on, so some of them overlap. But you can see that either of these two categories, heart disease or cancer, all by themselves equal all the other things put together. So if we can really have an impact on the first two, we're doing a great deal. And so now, of course, this business, and I won't talk only about excess weight, don't worry. That just happens to be something that I'm fairly knowledgeable about and interested in. And of course, nobody in this room has ever struggled with excess weight, I realize. So this really applies to, your neighbor, perhaps, a family member. Maybe you've read about the issue, or a coworker. So if there's somebody you know that struggles with this issue, then something you hear here might be of passing interest. Turns out that most heart disease is really preventable. I say temporarily because obviously you're not going to live to be 200. At some point, you're probably going to go down. But if we can at least delay it for a while, then we've achieved something. Tobacco, which we'll talk again. This is a gentle, supportive, non-nagging kind of thing, but it's something that I talk about with my patients every single day. In order to, again, keep them around for a while. And, my father had a heart attack associated with tobacco use. Physical inactivity. And physical activity, by the way, is not quite the same thing as exercise. Physical activity is the broader category, and then exercise is regimented physical activity. So that's one kind of physical activity. And if you're somebody who is already exercising, who is already fairly regimented, then you're not really somebody who I'm not concerned about because you're not at risk. And obviously in my line of work as a family doctor, I want to focus on the people who are at greater risk, and that means, it's a challenge because our society has become what's called obesogenic. That is to say, it tends to promote excess weight for various reasons, and that has to do there's a million different things that go into that, whether it's, and this is a huge one, is government policy. Government policies either promote or discourage excess weight, and that can include things like, forbidding the sale of, regular sodas in schools, for example. Or various kinds of tax policies. We have tax policies that actually subsidize corn, for example, and yet we grow more corn than anything. Usually subsidies are used to promote growing something that you don't grow enough of, and instead here we are subsidizing something that we grow too much of. And so there's this huge amount of corn out there, and therefore corn makes it into our beverages, it turns into sweeteners. Half the products you buy in the store are made out of corn, or at least have corn put into them. That wasn't enough, so they decided that we needed to burn it, even though it's a relatively inefficient way to get that kind of biofuel and stuff like that. So And then, again, some of the issues that go behind, I'm going to wander a little bit here, not only because that's my nature, but also because, unfortunately for you, I was told this morning that I was to expand my talk because Mike isn't here. So we'll try to struggle through. Yeah. So let's see, lock the doors, yeah. Make sure they sign the colon hydrotherapy. Yeah, there you go. Yeah. So, well, it turns out that, now by the way, I don't use the word fat to describe people. I use fat to describe fat tissue. In other words, this is sort of a scientific approach. Everybody has fat tissue. You need fat tissue to survive. We used to think that, fat was merely a storage tissue, that is a place to put excess energy for when there's a famine and so on and so forth. And yes, it does do that, but it turns out that fat is much more complex than that. And as we've learned more about adipose tissue or fat tissue, it turns out that it is a major producer of hormones, many hormones, with complex effects on the body. And so we have to take that into account. And abdominal fat, in particular, behaves differently than fat in other parts of the body. Abdominal fat tends to be more hormonally active, and it tends to produce, for example, estrogens. It converts estrogen precursors into estrogen. So by having more abdominal fat, you quite literally will get more estrogen floating around your body. Now, both men and women have estrogen normally. Women tend to have more, of course. But basically, by having excess abdominal fat, it's like taking birth control pills in a sense, whether you're a man or a woman. And then, of course, excess cholesterol or triglycerides can also contribute to heart disease. So and again, some of this is genetic, but of course, my own mother, for example, often had cholesterols over 300, which is quite high. And then cancers. Surprisingly enough, we tend to think of cancer as being this random thing that just sort of comes in from outer space and attacks people and stuff like that. And it is, of course, a frightening and scary thing. But it turns out that many cancers are preventable. And exactly what percentage is preventable is still being discussed, but obviously tobacco use is right in there. My father, again, had just about every disease known to man. And he had lung cancer, and that was chopped out, and then he had bladder cancer, which finally took his life eventually. But he lived to be 88, so again, I don't, maybe smoking helped him actually, but so anyway, physical inactivity has been, there's very good evidence, and again, I'm trying to have an evidence-based discussion here. There's very good evidence that physical inactivity, relatively sedentary behavior, is correlated with certain cancers. Colon cancer in particular, to a certain extent breast cancer. One interesting study they did with breast cancer, for example, was they looked at women who had already had breast cancer, and of course, after you've had treatment, then the job is to prevent recurrence of the breast cancer. And they, divided groups of women into some that were walking every single day and those that were not. And the ones that walked every day had significantly less recurrence of breast cancer. So there's something about physical activity. And again, if you're one of the regimented exercisers, then more power to you. But 90% of us are not the regimented exercisers. And so we need to try to find ways to integrate increased physical activity, that is to say, moving more, into the things we're already doing. There are different ways to do that, and of course you've heard some of these, and maybe you're doing some of these, but for example, as simple as when you drive your car somewhere, if you have to drive your car somewhere, of course in Houston, sometimes you don't have any choice, but if you drive your car somewhere, try to park further away. We're humans, we tend to be hyper efficient, at least in our thinking, and so we'll drive around for 5 minutes trying to find a spot that's like a couple of car spaces closer. So deliberately park farther away. Build that activity into your world. If it's patients will tell me, well, the reason I'm not doing my walking every day is because it's too hot, or it's too cold, or it's too wet, or it's too dry, or it's too dark, or it's too light, or something. There's always something that is going on outside that prevents you from walking. Well, in that case, build the activity into your world. Get a stepper, and if you can't miss that 8 o'clock TV show or whatever TV show it is, then put a stepper in your living room. It becomes part of the furniture. You can't put it in the closet because we all know that it will never emerge from the closet. And then whenever a commercial comes on, you must get out of the chair. You're not allowed to be sitting during a commercial, and you just do that stepper routine the whole time the commercial's on, which is only 2 minutes typically. And then you've built 20 minutes of physical activity into your normal, totally sedentary hour of watching TV. Something like that. So there's various different ways that we can integrate moving more into what we're already doing. It doesn't have to be, people will say, I can't afford to go to the gym. Well, okay, if you can't afford to go to the gym, then integrate activity into your world in some other way. It seems fairly clear, again, from the evidence that eating more vegetables and to a certain extent fruits seems to have certain anti-cancer qualities. There's a little bit of controversy about that, but because it also helps with preventing diabetes and preventing heart disease, then I think it's generally a good idea. And then there's vaccine-preventable viruses, whether it's HPV virus associated with cervical cancer, hepatitis B virus, which is the leading cause of liver cancer in the world. These are preventable by vaccines. They lend themselves to inexpensive screening. So if you haven't been screened for these things, you should be. Another preventable cause of death is lack of health insurance, which may be an issue for some people in the room. Well, if you haven't looked into the new Affordable Care Act and whether you're eligible for that or whether that might help you get insurance, I strongly encourage you to look into that. You can come to my clinic and get information on it if you want to, and I'll give you the address of the clinic if you don't. You can also go online, of course, and get information. If you live in Harris County, you may be eligible to get what used to be called the gold card. They don't call it the gold card anymore because I think they realized after a while that people got the wrong idea. That meant you could do anything with the card. But there's 4 tiers basically, and depending on your income level, if you live in Harris County again, depending on your income level, you will either pay little to nothing for your care, or a little bit more than that, or a little bit more than that, or slightly subsidized would be the 4th tier. And so that's another possibility. You can also go to a community health center. I work in a community health center, but there's also community health centers all around the Harris County area and surrounding counties. So there's almost certainly an affordable community health center close to you. That's a community that's owned and operated by the community. It's owned and operated by you, in essence. In fact, you could be on the board of the community health center and help determine policy. We operate by a sliding scale. So if you make less money, we charge less money. And we try to make things very affordable. At my clinic, we can do 40 blood tests for about $11, for example, just to give you an idea. So not every blood test in the world, but certain blood tests, And of course, the best health insurance of any kind is to stay healthy. I'm going to talk a little bit about smoking. Again, I know nobody here has ever smoked, but especially those funny little cigarettes, But in case you know somebody who is interested in maybe reducing their smoke intake, this might be helpful. I talk to patients, and I learned this actually from reading a medical journal a number of years ago. It wasn't one of the medical articles. It was every now and then they had tips from other doctors, and so doctors would write, I do this or I do that. And this was an old doctor from, I think, Kansas or something, saying that he used to tell his patients to put chewing tobacco between their toes. Because it turns out that nicotine is easily absorbed through the skin. Most things are not absorbed through the skin. Garlic is, for example. If you rub garlic all over your skin for some reason, it will come out in your breath. And probably not that popular. But it turns out that nicotine is the same way. It's readily absorbed through the skin. In fact, in tobacco growing regions, like in Virginia where I used to live, especially in southeast Virginia. It's quite common for tobacco pickers who go into the fields when there's a lot of dew or after it's rained or something like that, and they're harvesting the tobacco or what have you. It's very common to get nicotine poisoning requiring visits to the emergency room because of how readily nicotine is absorbed through the skin, just to give you an idea. And so any way you can get wet tobacco next to the skin, it's going to get absorbed. And we can draw your blood and measure nicotine levels. So I'll take questions at the end. And so an easy way to do that, of course, if you can buy the nicotine patches, then more power to you. I'm not sure with the new insurances. I imagine some of them will pay for that, some of them won't. But an easy way to do it at home is to buy chewing tobacco. Now, you're not going to chew it. This is just, we're using chewing tobacco because it's wet, and you need wet tobacco. Dry tobacco won't work. And you take about a pinch of the chewing tobacco, you open up a little pouch, take a pinch out about the size of 1 or 2 green peas. You wash and dry the left upper chest area, and then you flatten the tobacco out so it's not in a ball. You want as much of it exposed to the skin as possible, and you put a Band-Aid over it. You just made your own homegrown nicotine patch. And again, we could measure blood levels of nicotine after doing that. And that way, because a lot of people think, oh, I'm not really addicted, it's just a habit, blah, blah, blah. This is one of the most extensively studied things in all of medical science, and it's very clear that it is an addiction, and there's nothing to be ashamed about as far as having an addiction. We're all addicted to something, essentially. The average adult is addicted to coffee, and yet for most people, coffee doesn't cause significant health problems. So addiction is only a problem if the thing you're addicted to causes harm. Being in love with somebody is very much a kind of an addiction. Of course, sometimes that causes harm too. But there's the same chemistry involved. And you can have withdrawal symptoms when that person that you love is no longer there, and all of a sudden and stuff like that. So it is the same chemistry. So, but I tell my patients, I say, I don't care if you stay on nicotine for the rest of your life. Let's get rid of the smoke. The smoke is what's causing harm. So you can either stay on nicotine the rest of your life or use this technique for a few weeks in order to get away from the smoke part and then gradually come off of the nicotine part. I've discovered that it's better for my patients not to use the word quit. It seems the brain rebels against that. So I say, don't tell your brain that you're going to quit. Say, we're switching from method A of smoking to method B of smoking. And then you do it overnight, you do it all day, you're maintaining relatively constant levels of nicotine. One of the problems with smoking, of course, is that your levels go up after you smoke, nicotine levels, and then you're fine, and then as the levels go down, you start to get anxious, and then at some point you, quote, decide, unquote, gee, I think I'll have a cigarette. Well, you didn't decide anything. It basically is a mechanical thing, got down to this level, and then the parts of your brain that want the nicotine started telling the parts of your brain that make decisions, why don't you have a cigarette? Get those nicotine levels back up. So let's see here. And then the evidence again shows that those silly quit smoking helplines actually do work. People who use them are more successful at quitting than people who don't use them. So 1-800-QUIT-NOW. And then I will talk a little bit about excess weight. Don't worry, I won't dwell on it for too long. Sumo wrestlers are very interesting because they tell us a little bit about how physical activity fits into this whole thing. Sumo wrestlers are famously large, of course, and indeed they eat about 6,000 to 7,000 calories a day, every single day, in order to get big. That's part of their regimen. But they also exercise like crazy. And when you do CAT scans on people, it turns out that CAT scans are very good at showing fat distribution in the body. When you look at sumo wrestlers, and now you look at somebody who's large and isn't a sumo wrestler, the fat often tends to, especially if they have a lot of abdominal fat, which again behaves differently than other fat in the body. And people with a lot of abdominal fat, a lot of the fat tends to be around their organs and inside the blood vessels and stuff like that, which is not particularly healthy. But sumo wrestlers' body fat distribution is similar to that of a slender person. They have more of it, but it's not around the organs, for example. They have normal blood pressure, normal blood sugar, normal cholesterol, and so that's really very interesting. So in general, physical activity, if we can increase that level of physical activity in ways that don't seem too regimented, then that can help. Because even losing as little as 10 pounds can have an effect on your blood pressure, for example. And nearly anyone can lose weight. The trick, of course, is to keep it off because it usually comes back. There's something called the National Weight Control Registry, which is a very interesting thing where some academics from Colorado and Rhode Island decided to look at those relatively few people who succeed in maintaining weight loss. How did they do it? How are they different? And so they're tracking about 10,000 people now, and the criteria they use are lost at least 30 pounds and kept it off for at least a year. Or 2 years, I forget. But again, you can find this online. And so they basically got a huge pool of successful weight loss maintainers. You know, what's different about them? And so they do an exhaustive interview with them. I mean, pages and pages and pages where they find out everything from birth forward, and everything that you do, everything that you did, what happened when you were a child, all that kind of stuff, to see if they could identify patterns that might be useful to other people who are trying to do the same thing. And some of the patterns they've noted so far are most of these successful weight loss maintainers eat breakfast every day. All right, if I had a nickel for every patient who told me I'm just not a breakfast eater, I'd be a millionaire. Okay, and so it's so funny because every patient thinks they're totally unique, you know, and of course they are. They're totally unique, but they think they're totally unique in terms of not being a breakfast eater. Well, about 70% of my patients are not breakfast eaters, and that's probably why they're coming to see me so often. Basically, it turns out that eating breakfast really is important, you know, for a variety of reasons. If we starve our body, it tends to go into hyper-efficient metabolism, which sounds good, but it turns out it isn't. Hyper-efficient metabolism means that whatever calories you put in there, it's going to vigorously extract any extra weight from it that it can. Is that really what you want to happen? I don't think so. So, and again, most of these people are physically active every day. Notice I didn't say exercise, I just said physically active, you know. And they weigh themselves at least weekly. Different things help different people. It turns out nearly every diet has helped somebody. Now, I'm not talking about really obscure, bizarre diets where you're eating nothing but coconut oil for 4 years or something like that. You know, I'm talking about some of the more common diets. But nearly every diet has helped somebody. That's why it became popular. And also, diets, again, are a regimen. All diets involve some form of calorie restriction, and so if you stick with most of these diets, they're probably going to help on some level. Now, there may be other consequences. The Atkins diet teaches us very interesting things. I can have a separate talk just talking about some of these things in more detail if there's interest. So each of these diets teaches us certain things about how the body operates, but there can also be consequences, for example, you know, constipation and perhaps bone issues with the Atkins diet and that sort of thing. You know, pre-prepared meals, you know, meals where you already know the exact number of calories that's in it, you know, meal replacements for at least some of your meals. These are some of the things that can be helpful. Our tendency when we eat, of course, is to eat some food, but not really pay attention to serving size. The most important thing on a food label, of course, the first thing on a food label is the word nutrition label. Immediately after the nutrition label word is serving size. That's the most important thing on any food label is how much am I eating? Because all the numbers relate to the serving size. People say, oh, this one doesn't look like it has much sugar, and then they proceed to eat some food but not paying any attention to how much they're eating, and then they have no idea how many calories they're getting or how many grams of sugar or what have you. And sometimes, it's very interesting, sometimes even the order in which we eat foods makes a difference. You know, you have foods that turn into sugar quickly, you have foods that turn into sugar slowly. Starches turn into sugar quickly because starches are basically compressed sugars. That's what starches are. They don't taste sweet in the mouth, but as soon as it gets to here, it turns into sugar. And your body's thinking, why did you eat all that sugar? And you're thinking, I didn't eat all that sugar, I ate a bunch of starch. Well, it turns out it's the same thing. When a potato wants to store its energy, because a potato is, or like a carrot, for example, carrots aren't quite as bad as potatoes or rice or bread. But when these plants want to store their energy for future use, if they had to store it as sugar, it would be this big. And that's inconvenient for a plant to have a storage thing that's that big. So they mash all those sugars together into a starch. That's what a starch is. So it's okay to eat starches, but as we get older, we get a little more sensitive to starches, and you want to be careful about that. And the first bites of your meal should be fat or protein, all right, because that tends to slow down the sugars getting absorbed into the body. Juice and soda are essentially the same thing. So again, if you want something that tastes fruity, you eat the fruit, don't drink the fruit. And watch out for the white fluffy foods, as I suggested earlier. How do I know I'm succeeding with this? Because it's possible to lose weight while getting fatter. And what I mean by that is true fatness. There's a scientific definition of fatness, and that means what proportion of your body is fat tissue. And if you're not careful, that is to say, if you're doing your calorie restriction and perhaps not getting enough protein and not exercising very much, or not doing physical activity, I should say, you can lose weight but get fatter. That is to say, a higher proportion of your body will be fat. And then you're setting yourself up for future problems. So there's a good way to lose weight and a bad way to lose weight. And so your pants getting looser, however, or your dress size getting smaller, something like that, that suggests that you've lost abdominal fat, which, as we said, behaves differently than fat elsewhere in the body.